Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week, Earth has crabs. Of course, before I can give Earth a case of celestial crabs, I need to make Earth, which involves turning this little ball of aluminium foil into a bigger ball of aluminium foil. Then I can roll this aluminium Earth into a slightly rounder shape before spinning it until it develops a protective super sculpty layer. A quick initial smoothing will fix some of the misaligned tectonic plates, and I can bring out my planetary and rounding device, a little plastic cup with sharp edges. By rolling the wonky planet along the inside of the cup, the sharp edges will start to peel away the excess clay in a relatively uniform pattern, creating a damn near spherical sphere. I can fill in any of the dips, then roll it for a wee while longer before baking it to lock the shape. What you didn't see was an air bubble forming during the baking, causing an unsightly planet-sized goiter to form that I had to cut away and rebake, but I did all that off camera to make it look like this was a flawless process. Otherwise, it's time for some sanding. After more than a little sanding, my celestial body is angelically smooth but still has a few unsightly gaps to fill, which I'll do by adding a little bit more clay and sanding again until I finally got a nice, smooth, round ball ready for a bit of paint. To make my life a little easier when I draw the continents onto Earth, I'll start by priming the whole thing white. Next, I need to mark out the center of the sphere, which in the past I've tried to do through the magic of math, but I barely passed grade 12 algebra, and that was a few years ago, so my spherical numerology is a little foggy. Instead, I'm going to figure out how tall my ball is, then find an appropriately sized cup to rest a pencil on, and just spin it to win it. I then did the same thing for a perfectly perpendicular line to give me my north and south poles. Then I can break out my laptop and log into Google Earth so as I can begin the days-long process of transferring the continents onto the planet. And that's the continents, not continents, so the land masses rather than the ability to control one's bowels. Both are obviously important, but very different things. With the poles in place and the equatorial line delineated, I drew a few more lines to help me get the size of each landmass correct. This is my second time making a teeny tiny Earth, and it's long enough ago that I don't remember how I did it last time, but this was a planet-sized ball ache. Eventually, I got a pretty good approximation of what it's supposed to look like though, so I can start to add some color. I'll start by outlining each of the land masses in some light ocean blue, trying to stay roughly within the lines, but this is more of a first pass that I can finesse in the later stages of creation. Otherwise, once I've got the coasts coated in a coastal blue and I've roughly painted the oceans, I can blast the blue with an airbrush to get a smoother, more uniform color, followed by some variations in the deeper oceans with a darker blue. Once the watery bits have been filled in, I can begin coloring the land masses, starting with the sandy colors, followed by the browns and greens, and finally the whites to clean up all the snowy bits. I'll stick with the airbrush for now to speed up the process, before swapping over to a normal brush, which will let me add a lot more texture and really finesse the shape of the coasts and all the textury bits inside the continents themselves. Up until now, I haven't really been having a very good time with this, but adding all these little bits and bobs and turning this blobby blue and green ball of nothing into a kind of earth-looking lump of clay is tickling my pickle in ways I hadn't expected. Finally, once I've cleaned up the coastlines and added some variation to the land in line with what you might see when you look at Google Earth, I can start to do the same to the oceans to add the various color variations that turn our beautiful ocean world into a terrifyingly unknowable aquatic hellscape. Last but not least, what's a planet without plentiful clouds hiding all the meticulous work I just spent several days making? I'll lay down an initial dusting with the airbrush to create the soft edges of my cloud cover before coming back with a sponge to add some slightly rougher texture and build up the cloud cover until it's nice and fluffy. Otherwise, with that final piece of this planetary puzzle in place, I can set it aside while I get to making my massive, moon-sized crustaceans. Why am I making massive moon-sized crabs fighting on top of the Earth? I have no idea. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Now, as far as making a miniature giant space crab, the process is fairly straightforward, assuming you already know how to make a normal-sized, non-celestial crab. I don't, but if I let a lack of knowledge or skill stop me, then this channel would never exist. To that end, I've poked a set of 4 holes into each side of my crabby body, as well as a little mouth into the center that I can then use to delineate the center line that I can use to give this little crab a set of crab abs. I'll then work my way around the rest of the non-ab part of the crab, adding semi-random bits of texture and detail in the hopes of overwhelming the eye into not asking too many questions before sticking some little goopy googly bits into the mouth to make a creepy, googly space crab mouth. A last little finagling of the oral fingers will make them look appropriately inappropriate for a space crab, and I'll work my way around the body one last time, unsmoothing all the smooth bits, then it's into the oven to bake, so I can drill some teeny tiny holes into the not as teeny tiny side holes so I can fit some little lengths of armature wire inside. I'll then snip the tip to length, pushing the front wires out of the way and bending the back wires into crab-like shapes so I can start the inlegging process. Trying to add clay to wire at this scale is a bit of a faff, so instead I'll start by coating each of the legs in a layer of liquid clay to create a surface that the subsequent layer of clay can hold on to a bit better. I'm also going to yank my crab's pincers off since they're not fit for purpose and kinda just get in the way, then I can get to work building up the legs by adding an initial thin layer of clay over the cured liquid clay, adding little lumps and bits here and there until I've got some sharper, more defined legs that I can stick a bunch of little balls onto to form the teeny tiny crab spikes on each of the legs. Nothing screams gigantic space crab quite like leg spikes, so I made sure to really lean into that aesthetic, then some poking and prodding to gnarl up the surface a bit more and add some scrapes and cuts, and I can get back to the front where I'll fill the pincer holes with a lump of clay, into which I can press some slightly more shapely crab arms that I can then cut to size and bend into the correct position before layering up the clay in several stages. To be entirely honest, at this point, the crab's probably been into the oven a half dozen times by now since there's so little to hold on to that I need to bake each added section to keep from ruining the detail. As far as the arms are concerned, the wire is so weak that I need to add an initial layer of clay just to give me something solid to work on top of. Eventually, though, I've got enough of a base that I can start to add the final layer, which can be sharpened and shaped into deadly crab claws, complete with a plethora of teeny tiny, gigantic spikes. Finally, before I bake the arms, I'll work my way around the limbs, adding little dots of liquid clay to create lots of little lumps that would otherwise be too annoying to do with normal clay. With the arms done, I'll fit the crab onto a little sticky block so I can begin building the shell on its back, starting by slapping a little lump of fresh clay on top and shaping out the sides so it kind of looks like a crab shell. I don't know what I'm doing. I said earlier this is my first crab and I'm just doing what feels right. What definitely does feel right though is adding some texture to the top of the shell, so I'll mark out the center line so that I can add some scales that are mirrored on either side. Once I've marked out the design, I'll clean up the edges by roughing up the edges so they don't look so clean, then I'll poke a bunch of teeny tiny divots into the side of the shell into which I can fit some teeny tiny, gigantic, pre-baked spikes. To make the eyes, I'll press my ball stylus into the front of the shell and fill the dip with some balls of clay to create a nice layered effect. Then I'll take a teeny tiny clay sausage and squish it onto my smallest ball stylus, then bake it with a heat gun. This will leave me with a little eyeball-less eyeball stalk that I can press firmly into the eye dips, which can then finally be filled with a final teeny tiny eyeball. Last but not least, before one final bake, I'll add lots of little liquid clay dots all over the crab's back for that final crab-like texturing, and that's my miniature giant space crab finished. All that's left to do then is all of that a second time to create my second crab, and I'm ready for some paint. I'll start this time by priming the crabs in a black surface primer since I want to add some color shift colors and they recommend black as the base coat. As far as the color shifts are concerned, I have a turquoise violet and a green gold cold blue, which means nothing as far as the names are concerned, so I'll just throw the colors onto the crabs and see what they look like. After a couple coats and some time to dry, I really like the colors, but they need a bit of detailing and contrast, so for the blue crab I'll add some orangey yellow as a highlight on the bottom and around the edges, before coming back with a darker orange to build up some variation as well as give the space between the scales a bit of interest. Unfortunately, while I really like the idea of shiny color shift celestial space crabs, the blue and green colors I have kinda get lost in the green and blue of the planet, so I think I'm going to ditch this and go back to my original plan of bright orange. Orange is notoriously obnoxious to paint over darker colors, so I'm going to reprime over top of the previous coat with some white so I can build up some more vibrant, colorful base coats. I'll give the bottom of the crabs a sandy bone white coloring, then flip them over and blast the top with a nice bright orange. I'll then bring back my sponges and work my way back and forth with the orange from the top and the bone white from the belly to create a harsher, less blended crossover of the two colors before cracking out the brush so I can do a little bit more detail coloring of the horns and spikes scattered around the body. I'll then give the whole body a wash in umber ink to tone the vibrancy down a tiny bit and add some shading to the shell, dabbing away the excess as I go. Once it's dried, I can bring back some lighter shades to add a bit of contrast and texture, as well as draw some lines in the shell and add some last little details with an ivory white. I'll then paint the eyes white and give the goobery mouth bits a pinkish tone, then it's back to set eyes to give them a couple coats of extra vibrant fluorescent blue. I want to limit the amount of air bubbles when I foolishly decide to encase this all in resin, so I'll fill the mouth with some UV resin and cure it in place, which subsequently shows how shiny those eyes are with a little blacklight therapy. Otherwise, once the mouths are filled, I've got two brilliantly orange space crabs ready to fight over a teeny tiny planet Earth. Now I need some way to hold Earth upright, and I figured a little acrylic rod would do the trick, so I'll drill an appropriately sized hole in the bottom and slip the rod in so I can mount it all on a block of wood. Then once I've got the correct position of my battling space crabs, I'll lock them in place with a little UV resin, as well as fill the hole in the bottom of the planet to ensure no air bubbles will come flowing out while the resin cures. Finally, with all my holes filled, I want to make sure that none of the paint leaches into the resin, as I want it to be perfectly clear, since that's just really there to suspend everything in a spatial void, so I'll take a little extra time to give the whole scene a clear coating of high gloss varnish. Then letting it sit for 24 hours to cure, I can safely say that this is by far the most well prepared I've ever been for a resin pour, and I look forward to encountering zero issues from here on out. I've got some time while I wait for the varnish to cure, so I've cut myself some thick sheets of Perspex with which to build my spatial box. I'll use some heavy-duty quick-set silicone to glue the edges of the frame together, as well as to ensure that it's watertight. A full 24 hours later, both the silicone and gloss varnish are cured, and I'm ready to start putting it all together. A bead of UV resin in the center of the box will help to hold my acrylic rod in place, and, well, it turns out Earth is a bit too heavy for this rod, so I'll pull it out and try something different. Normally when I'm embedding stuff in resin, I like to use high-strength invisible fishing line because it's high-strength and invisible, but I opted for the rod since I wasn't sure how I was going to get it to hold the ball. However, now that physics has forced my hand, I ended up building a semi-functional support system with the help of tape and lots of UV resin, but I think it's pretty much centered, and at least the line is a lot less visible than the rod. It's got a bit of a wobble, but the resin is dense enough that it should keep it from moving around at all once the whole scene is submerged, so with that in mind, let's make some resin. As always, I'm using the same 2-part epoxy resin that mixes in a 2-to-1 ratio, but this time I don't want to tint the resin at all since it's space, and space doesn't have any color, which is why it's black. The other thing about space is that it doesn't contain any air, which means I need to get rid of all these air bubbles, so it's time to pop this bad boy into my resin debubbling device, which will suck all the air up and out of the resin, leaving me with a nice, bubble-free resin ready to be poured. All that's left to do then is pour this beautiful resin into my watertight, fully cured resin form and enjoy a problem-free pour. Except as it turns out, Earth is a lot more buoyant than I had expected. So I'll take a moment to collect my thoughts and figure out how to salvage this. Eventually I figured if the ball is too buoyant, then I need something to hold it down, so we're back to the acrylic rod, but this time I'll plant it in the top and fix it in place so it keeps the planet from floating up, thereby defeating gravity, at which point I can sit back and enjoy a flawless pour. Well, I forgot that these rods aren't particularly strong, so obviously the weight of the ball floating is going to bend the rod and it's going to start floating out of the center onto the wall. So it's back to the drawing board, trying not to panic as several liters of resin slowly curing reminds me that time is a finite resource. Eventually, however, I came up with this monstrosity of a solution. Basically, I re-drilled the hole in the bottom for my rod to keep it from drifting and kept the rod in the top to keep it from floating. Looking back now, I see that my original single rod design would have been perfect, but at this point, even after draining all the resin out of the box, there's no surefire way to get the rod to adhere to the base, so this is the solution, which is frustratingly thematic for this channel because it's not good, but it is good enough. With that though, I can finally pour my resin one last time and I guess pray a little bit. I did have to debubble the resin again though, since it got pretty bubbly going back and forth between the pails, but at this point I have such low expectations and I'm not even sure this video will ever see the light of day. However, somehow, despite everything, 72 hours later I've got this, which is a surprisingly successful pour. Yeah, there's a few spots where the resin's pulled away from the corners of the frame, which is pretty standard when you're pouring something this thick as the resin heats up and shrinks, but all told, it's perfectly acceptable. Once I've pulled away the form on the front to get access to the most egregious of the air bubbles, I can slowly fill them with UV resin to hide the worst of it. In the future, I may sand it back on all sides to remove all the problem spots, but for now this will work long enough to get this video done, and any of the really awkward parts I can just Photoshop out to make the thumbnail pretty. After all, the real secret to a perfect resin pour is hiding the mistakes and Photoshopping the rest of it. Otherwise, with the air pockets filled, I can peel away the rest of the perspex and cut off the resin that's begun to creep up the edges. Finally, I can use a little palm plane to chamfer the edges so I don't slice myself open, and I think at this point I've had just about enough, so let's get on to the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, Carquiechu, Jackie Gutierrez, Tristan Martin, Jackson Thomas, Brynjolfur, Baron Sheep, Eve, Burzip is a Frog, The Guy Who Loves Terry the Octoskull, Salix Shadow, Laura Reimer, Lang Connor, Amy Liz Ray, Cosmic Karma, Peach, Rachel, Deleems, Marza the Queer Lady, Rebecca, Andre Neubauer, Hey Mom Look I'm in North of the Borders video, Crafter Can't Craft, Jeremy Weimer, Pineapple Boy, Mother of Moosamus Goosamus Fee-Fi Fofusamus, Cadneil Hernandez, Power Wheel K, Shannon Sweeney, Nuno, Joseph Smith, Seb, and Zaki Chan. You are the teeny tiny populace that screams as this double combat crap of a channel fights in the space above you. With January coming to a close, I should be back to my mostly regular Friday uploads, but that's entirely dependent on if I feel like it. So, you know, keep coming back and watching these videos. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.